Rules Committee to come to order, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. This afternoon we have a very important hearing on testimony for H.R. 3457, the Justice for Victims of Iranian Terrorism Act. This bill is being presented to us today. Prohibits the lifting of sanctions on Iran until their government pays the judgments that is owed to victims that are come from acts of terrorism, where the actual state of Iran is responsible for these terrorist actions, and they're being held accountable for that. As we all know, Iran is complicit in some of the most horrific acts of terrorism in American history. It's baffling why the administration is willing to inject nearly $150 billion into the Iranian economy, even though its government owes its victims unpaid damages. If the administration is willing to stimulate Iran's economy through its nuclear deal, surely it will make sure that the victims that are owed as a result of terrorism and thuggery by the Iranians, they would be fully compensated. The FSIA, which is the Foreign Sovereignty Immunities Act, has a process that has been followed, and it has accumulated a debt of $43.5 billion in unpaid damages through more than 80 FSIA cases. And this is what Iranian government is being held accountable for, and we believe the money should come out of this first before it is passed on. Delighted today to know that Pat Meehan from Pennsylvania, who's the author of this bill, briefed members of Congress this morning on the nature of this bill, but today we have one of the most distinguished judges from Texas, a member of Congress, Judge Ted Poe, who was here not only to talk about this, but to update us, and I'm sure to give us the insight into not only the terrorism that took place, but really why it's in our best interest to do this. And Judge, before we welcome you, we want to defer to the ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, and we'll do that now. The gentleman's recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will begin my remarks today the same way I began them yesterday and ask my friends in the majority, whatever happened to regular order? Here's yet another bill that's coming before the Rules Committee that had no hearings, had no markup in the Foreign Affairs Committee. I appreciate the fact that Mr. Poe is here, but I don't know why he's here, because the Foreign Affairs Committee didn't take any action on this bill. And again, I don't know how much trouble it would have been to put a hearing together and do a markup. You could do that in a day, but at least give the appearance that we're going through a process here of regular order. You know, this bill I don't think is going to go anywhere anyway. I mean, the aim of this bill really is to sabotage the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was negotiated. This is all about cheering for failure. I think we all believe that victims of terrorism should receive compensation, but doing so at the expense of the agreement to deny Iran a nuclear weapon, I don't think is the way to go. But again, on this bill, we're told no hearings and certainly no markup, and here we are going to the floor. I think we very much object to the process. But having said that, you're in charge. You can do whatever you want to do, and I will yield back my time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the gentleman's comments. Judge Poe, we're delighted that you're with us. Obviously, anything you haven't write into leave for our awesome stenographer, Shannon, who's here today. We appreciate that. The gentleman, if he'll please make sure he's got his microphone on. I'm sure it's green right there aiming at you. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank the chairman and the ranking member for letting me stop by today, and the entire Rules Committee for considering House debate on H.R. 3457, the Justice for Victims of Iranian Terrorism Act. This bill, with 80 co-sponsors, including myself, was introduced by our colleague, Pat Meehan from Pennsylvania. On the Foreign Affairs Committee, I have the honor of serving as chairman of the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade. And of course, Iran has been a central focus of my committee and the full committee. Mr. Chairman, since coming to power in the 70s, the Iranian regime has actively supported terrorism worldwide. Many people forget that it funded groups such as Hezbollah and Hamas and directed their operations. and their attacks include attacks and murder of Americans. In 1983, bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon, and the 1996 bombing of the Kohar Towers in Saudi Arabia, together these attacks killed 260 American servicemen, 260 of America's finest. Their families have not seen justice since these attacks occurred, sponsored by the Iranian government. There have been other attacks that have killed or harmed Americans that have been linked to Iranian support or financing. So under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, U.S. victims of state-sponsored terrorism, and Iran is the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world, these victims have the ability to bring suit in American courts and collect damages. And U.S. courts have held Iran liable for a number of attacks carried out by terrorist proxies. Federal judges have heard these cases. They've awarded judgments to the victims of these attacks, requiring Iran to compensate the victims and their families for these losses since the 70s. Indeed, dozens of these judgments are still outstanding. According to a CRS tally, Iran owes over $43 billion in unpaid damages through more than 80 cases over the last 15 years. In one case, U.S. District Judge found that Iran directed the 1983 attack on the U.S. Embassy in Beirut and carried it out through a Hezbollah suicide bomber who drove a van packed with 2,000 pounds of explosives to the front door. Tehran was found liable for $320 million in damages to 47 American victims. In another attack, $9 billion was awarded to victims of the bombing of the Marine barracks a year later. Again, the Iran was found responsible after a trial in the United States. These judgments, like all the others, remain unpaid. Mr. Chairman, the Obama administration, during its negotiations with Tehran, unfortunately did not seek in the negotiations for Iran to compensate the families and their surviving victims of those that were taken in the Iran terrorism, despite U.S. American lawful court judgments against the government of Iran. Unfortunately, U.S. officials have admitted they didn't even try to have justice for these victims. That's in contrast to the Libyan nuclear disarmament a decade ago, when the United States secured an agreement for the Gaddafi regime to compensate victims of attacks such as the bombing of Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. Meanwhile, Iran will soon be obtaining tens of billions in unfrozen assets, as well as gain economic and financial benefits by escaping the sanctions regime and integrating into the global economy. Doesn't seem fair and just and right that America should let this slide. So Representative Meehan has stepped forward with legislation to address the injustice for these victims, especially those silent ones that have been buried for a long time. The legislation is straightforward: no sanctions relief until Iran pays what it lawfully owes the victims of these American victims who were killed and harmed by the state sponsor of terror, Iran. And that's just the way it is. I'll yield back.
Judge, thank you very much. Judge, sans this legislation, what process would take place for this $43.5 billion to be paid out to the victims as a result of these cases where judges have ordered this?
The assets that are frozen in the United States that belong to the Iranian government, legally, a process could be formed where those would be attached to the specific victims, the assets that are frozen here in the United States and in American banks.
So let me go back to Lockerbie and Libya. You briefly discussed it, but the United States of America secured in some agreement with the Libyans for them to reimburse those victims. Does it require agreement with the Iranians for these funds to be given? Or,
in my opinion, yes.
So it would take some agreement. And so you're simply saying we should pay the victims or freeze that money and not
Correct.
let it go.
The judgments have already been issued by different federal judges against the government of Iran.
Yes, sir.
And now it's incumbent upon each of those cases for the people who filed the lawsuit to obtain that judgment through diplomatic and lawful court remedies that we have in the United States. It's a combination of both, how those assets could be seized based upon the original legislation that was passed back in the 70s, the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. So there are procedures in there how it can be collected by the victims.
Yes, sir. I saw a movie, I don't remember, something, a painting of gold or something, where I saw a woman who owned a piece of art who the Germans, the Nazis, confiscated, and it was given, it was found, and I watched, it was a movie, and they went through the process of getting that painting back, and they went through this same FSIA case and went all the way to the Supreme Court. So I know these are long precedents that have to be established to actually get things done. And of course, they could see where the painting was and the value that it had. So it's a very interesting process. I was unaware of this until Mr. Meehan brought this issue up a couple weeks ago. So thank you very much. Dr. Burgess?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Judge Poe, thank you for being here and presenting this to us in such a succinct fashion. I guess my question is just similar to what Mr. Sessions was just observing. I don't understand why, if these are lawful judgments that have been rendered in U.S. courts and the assets, even though they're Iranian assets, are being held in U.S. banks, why has that money not been dispersed? Why does it take an act of Congress, if you will, to get that money to the victims?
Iran has not agreed to pay, so it would take a diplomatic procedure such as negotiations with the Iranian government to pay the judgments. The judgments have been, as I mentioned, lawfully obtained in the United States, and so it's incumbent upon the United States through, I think, Congress to enforce the judgments by requiring Iran to pay, since they won't agree to pay. We have the money, and I think we can garnish the money. This is my opinion. We can garnish the money in American banks to do that with this legislation.
So is it the problem has been that there just has not been a diplomatic vehicle since there have been no diplomatic relations with that country for so long?
That's part of the problem, yes.
Well, let me ask you this. It seems then if I understand that part correctly, and that the disposition of that money back to the victims does not occur as a result of this negotiation, do those victims have, could they seek remedy against the United States of America for not representing their interest in this negotiation that was just concluded?
I don't know. I don't know if they would have a lawsuit, a case in court, in the federal court, for not enforcing the judgment. I do not know the answer to that question. The timing on this is such that the sanctions are tied, the relief of sanctions on the Iranian deal are tied to this legislation, that we don't lift the sanctions on Iran unless they pay the lawful judgments that have taken place in the U.S. in the specific cases of, not other cases, but only the cases of victims of terror that were sponsored by the Iranian government.
Well, I think that only seems reasonable, and I thank you for bringing it to us today, and I hope we're successful in getting these families the compensation they deserve, and I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Burgess. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeah, well, let's be honest, this will get families nothing. This is just, we're going through an exercise here that is leading nowhere. If it did, basically it would result in us unilaterally reneging on this agreement, which would mean that the sanctions that were in place by the international community would be lifted, and so we would be giving Iran a great gift without demanding anything in return with regard to their nuclear program. But putting that aside, the gentleman from Texas had some questions. you know what, in a hearing, those questions could have been asked and answered, but there was no hearing. And I, you know, and I appreciate Mr. Poe's statement here today, but if I were him, I would be before this committee with an opening statement chiding this Congress and this Rules Committee for bringing a bill to the floor that bypassed you and bypassed every member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, basically deeming all of you irrelevant in this process. And I think that is bad for the committee process in this Congress. People on the Foreign Affairs Committee who have different opinions on legislation like this ought to have hearings and ought to have a markup. And there's no reason why this should be had to be up today. It could have been up next week. You could have had a hearing. You could have had a markup. But you know, this has become a pattern. And Mr. Poe, this is just the latest in a series of bills that has come before us that has just bypassed the committees of jurisdiction. And I think people get on these committees for a reason, because they care about the subject matter and they want to make a difference. You know, the notion that we don't have the time to do a hearing or a markup on this bill and it's come right to the floor, there's no testimony, no report. I mean, maybe correct me if I'm wrong. Was there a hearing or a markup that I'm missing? I know you just got passed a note. Was there something that I'm missing here in terms of a hearing or a markup on this legislation?
The only thing I would comment about the hearing specifically, Mr. McGovern, you're correct. It has been no specific hearing on this. It's been mentioned in numerous hearings. There have been approximately 30 hearings on Iran, several in my subcommittee. This has been mentioned, but you're correct. It has not been marked up, this specific bill.
And I guess and this is not a criticism of you, it's just of my friends up here. What's the big deal? Why not a hearing and why not a markup? Why is that such a controversial, radical idea? And again, this is becoming a pattern. Look, it's on the Rules Committee, and we're basically, you know, the gateway for everything. But if I were on the Foreign Affairs Committee, I'd be a little bit miffed that the entire committee was bypassed on this, and no matter where I stood on this issue. So I thank you for being here. It would have been nice if there had been a hearing and a markup that we could have referred to, but we're not going to be given that privilege. Instead, we're going to bring this to the floor, and my guess is, Mr. Poe, are you asking for an open rule on this, given the fact that there was no markup? Are you asking that we open this up so that everybody can legislate on the floor?
I'm going to leave that up to the Rules Committee. It doesn't make me any difference.
All right. I thought I'd give you an opportunity to, you know, give everybody in this House, Democrats and Republicans alike, an opportunity to be heard on this. But anyway, I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Engel, you have now gracefully come in. We're in the middle of this hearing for H.R. 3457, and Judge Poe has offered an opening statement, and we have begun 3 members with questions to him. Would the gentleman wish?
Okay, may I be recognized?
Hold on just one second. Does the gentleman wish to be heard on this matter?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. If you'll hold just one moment, please.
Certainly.
The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Poe said he'd leave it up to the Rules Committee as to what we would decide, whether it's open or closed, but I just was handed a note from the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee who, notwithstanding the fact that there was no hearing and no markup, has requested a closed rule, which is stunning. But anyway, I ask unanimous consent that be made.
Without objection, we'll enter the gentleman, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee letter. That will be entered into the record. Judge Poe, wise choice. Mr. Engel, I'm delighted that you're here with us. As always, anything you have in writing will be entered the record. We have an awesome, one of the best stenographers in our pool that is with us today, and we're trying to do all we can do to help her out. So if you'll leave anything you have, we'd appreciate it, and the gentleman's recognized.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to members and to my good friend Judge Poe. You know, we have worked on the Foreign Affairs Committee with Chairman Royce in probably the most bipartisan manner of any committee in Congress. And I pride myself in saying that, so does Chairman Royce. And in doing so, we think we've made tremendous strides with all the members of our committee. Nobody in Congress would accuse me of being a pushover when it comes to Iran. I've authored sanctions bills, I oppose the nuclear agreement, and going forward, I'll do whatever I can do to hold Iran's leaders accountable and to keep a nuclear weapon out of their hands. And to add to that, I certainly have enormous sympathy for American victims of Iranian terrorism and their families. They deserve justice. But this bill has zero chance of bringing them that justice. To date, American courts have awarded roughly $46 billion for almost 1,300 victims and their families. And even if Iran had any intention of paying that amount, and I wouldn't bet on that, this legislation would actually make it more difficult for Iran to do so. You see, Iran only has access to about $20 billion of its reserves. All the other resources Iran would need to pay for these judgments are frozen by international sanctions. Iran cannot use these frozen resources to compensate victims. And of course, this bill says all those other resources stay frozen until Iran pays its judgments in full. So it's a catch-22. Because this bill isn't about providing justice to the victims of terrorism. It really just uses the suffering of those victims to score political points, and I just don't think that's right. The bill is the first volley in the effort to try to undermine the Iran deal. Look, I didn't like the Iran deal, but we had a vote. I'm still going to fight all these issues, but it looks like the effort that has taken so much of the House's time to undermine Obamacare, voting and re-voting on a settled issue, and like the effort to kill Obamacare, it just won't work. So rather, we should send legislation to the President that will strengthen enforcement for the nuclear deal, protect our friends and allies in the region, and crack down on Iran's support for terrorist organizations. I will soon offer measures to advance that agenda, and I hope to work with colleagues of both parties to pursue those goals. I have no doubt that in the Foreign Affairs Committee, Chairman Royce and I will develop reasoned, bipartisan legislation that will advance our interests around the world. So what we shouldn't do, with all due respect, is to flout regular order and ram through partisan legislation. This bill has no bipartisan support, it wouldn't accomplish anything, and it shouldn't be brought to the floor in this manner, in my opinion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. Mr. McGovern, we'll redirect questions to you for Mr. Engel. Judge Hastings.
Mr. Chairman. Judge Poe or Mr. Engel, do either of you know where Iran's frozen assets are and the amount of those frozen assets?
I don't know where they are in the United States, but the assets are anywhere from $50 billion up, is my understanding. But I'm not sure, Mr. Hastings.
Yeah, and that lack of assurance causes me concern. Let me put my bona fides on the table. I voted against the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And I don't believe there's a man or woman among us in the House of Representatives who do not favor doing everything that we can to assist the victims. But I put it to you, Judge, in this particular instance. One, we don't, I was giving your aide an opportunity to maybe give me a different answer to the question that I just asked with reference to the assets. Do you now know any more than you did a few minutes ago?
That's an interesting question on several issues. Most of the assets are abroad. It's $150 billion they're in China, European Union, Japan, South Korea.
Right. And that's one of the uncertainties. But you and I, as members of the judiciary in our other life, had enforcement powers once judgments were obtained against individuals. I don't know, I served in a court of competent jurisdiction, and I'm sure you did as well, and then I served in the federal judiciary. But when I was in the circuit court, I could put a person in jail if they didn't pay their child support to help collect child support. As a federal judge, I've stopped ships from leaving the port because they owed money. And I could go on and on and on about collection measures. Turning here to this particular measure, the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, you said, Judge Poe, in your testimony, that there is a process for the collection. The question then that I have is, if you or I, or if you were representing one of the victims in this case, would you not be in court seeking the same thing that the legislation here is seeking to do, and that's to force Iran through the measures that may be found here in the United States to have to pay? Would you not do that if you were one of their lawyers?
If I was one of the lawyers representing the litigants, I would use any current lawful means to get Iran to pay what has been ordered to be paid.
In your testimony earlier, in a response to Mr. Burgess's question, one of the things that you said was that Iran has not agreed to pay. When there is a judgment, and under the Foreign Services, under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, it would seem to me, and I don't know the act, and I think you and I need to read that act, and I think the author of this legislation needs to read that act to find if there is a provision that would allow for this to occur. Having said that, I'll move on to my next question, and that is, what do you think the implications are for, if this measure were to become law, for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action? Does it, in your judgment, cause that act, let me put it in lay terms, to go off the rails?
I didn't understand the last word.
I was trying to not use a lot of time. If this were to become law, would it have implications that would cause the agreement in the JCPOA to go off the rails? In other words, what kind of consequences would obtain if this were to be the law as it pertains to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action?
It's my belief that it would cause the assets to be frozen that we had control over, and it would affect the plan in that way, yes.
In other words, then, unilaterally, as Mr. McGovern put it, we would be causing, if we could, and that's the next question, is the constitutionality of this. You and I would probably have argued that this should have been a treaty in the first place, but since it was not, and it is an agreement, would we not then be putting our currency as a partner to the agreement at risk, and cause not only Iran, but our other partners in the agreement to feel that we are not to be trusted if it is that our Congress, after voting on a measure, after considering it, after the measure is agreed, now we're going to come back and take another tack and say that we want to do something that will cause it not to be enforced. I'm not understanding that.
I'm not sure I understood your question. I think Iran, as you have said, has these judgments against them, and this legislation would require enforcement of the judgments under the sanctions relief. The sanctions wouldn't be lifted until they paid these judgments.
But there are sanctions, primary and secondary, that are still in place, Judge.
That's correct.
And those assets are probably assets that the United States can reach. But that sanction, they aren't being lifted because of this agreement. Mind you now, I'm opposed, was opposed to this agreement. But at some point you have to decide, all of us, that fine. We had our day
in court.
And we didn't do what you and I probably would have wanted us to do. And you understand now, you're looking at a Democrat that didn't vote for this measure. And in essence, one would argue that I voted against my party. But I voted because I didn't believe that this agreement was a good agreement. I still do not believe that. But at the very same time, I'm not willing to participate with you or anybody else at this point that's going to do after the fact what we could have done before. In short, the author of this legislation, if he or she had that idea initially, they could have been arguing to the administration, as I did, and I can show you letters that I wrote to the administration requesting certain particulars be added to the understandings that were trying to be reached. And it's a sad state of affairs that we find ourselves in, and I agree with Mr. McGovern. This is more political than it is policymaking, and it implicates much too strongly, Judge. It implicates our country and the value of our agreements, which I have a disagreement with, and that's troubling to me. I'll leave it at that in the interest of time, but I can't see myself supporting this, and I would urge members not to, largely for the reasons that I've implicated. And I do want to include, Mr. Chairman, in the record, the unclassified sanctions that will remain in place under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
That objection so ordered.
They got a rotating chairs over here.
Just keep getting better, though.
Hey,
It
you
keeps
move up.
moving up the
You
ladder.
move up all the way damn fast in the Republic.
Any further questions, Judge? Mr. Stivers, you have any questions? Mr. Polis?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, so how many of these cases are there where there's settlements against Iran, and what's the approximate total dollar amount there?
About $43 billion.
And how many cases?
There are 80.
80 cases, separate cases. So, I mean, it seems to me if there's a problem here, it wouldn't be specific to Iran. A non-attorney, I've heard several people discuss this. I mean, if there's a problem where judgments against foreign countries that have assets here can't be enforced, that probably needs to be addressed. I don't know if there is or isn't. I would need to see evidence, but I think a thoughtful processing committee where, has this happened with other countries when there's settlements against them? Is there a mechanism to do that? Iran isn't special. They don't get exemptions from mechanisms we use to enforce judgments against other countries, that's for sure. So, I mean, is this a problem with settlements against, or judgments against other countries as far as you know?
There are means to get other countries to pay, but the issue here, of course, is that it's acts of terrorism, specific statute that allowed these victims to sue under American courts to get judgment. So it's specific statute, and
Has that statute been used for any other terrorists other than Iran?
I do not know. Because Iran is the chief state sponsor of terror. That's why this legislation was passed to begin with.
Well, there have been others, and you know, at times it's been Libya, at times it's
North
been
Korea.
So I don't know. Maybe the staff has an answer if there's other states that the statute has been used against. Again, I mean, I think I don't think it's terribly useful to discuss this strictly in the context of a judgment in Iran. We're not considering a judgment against Iran. If we lack teeth to this concept of holding terrorist states liable, and for some reason, unlike any other judgment, these judgments can't be enforced, I still don't understand why they can't be enforced. I mean, if the assets are here, a judge should be able to order them enforced. But if there's something that prevents that, then we need to remove that, because maybe this Terrorist Liability Act wasn't written well, I don't know, but let's get into that act, and that's why we have the committee process. I mean, you don't come here with some workaround and say Iran needs to pay or the tariffs aren't lifted. I mean, if there's a problem, Iran is not the only state sponsor of terrorism. Therefore, this wouldn't be a problem just with Iran. So, you know, have hearings. You know, is there a real problem? Get the experts in there. If there is, get a good bipartisan bill. You both are very dedicated to this, and, you know, come before us, and it'll probably pass on suspension. You probably won't even need to come to rules, because I don't think there's anybody in this body that would disagree with the concept that if there's a judgment against a state that conducts terrorism, it ought to be enforceable if they have assets here. So hopefully that's the kind of procedure we can follow moving forward, and I'll yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama.
Thank you. Mr. Poe, Mr. McGovern made a statement that you didn't get a chance to respond to, and I think it's very important. And I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I thought I heard him say that there is no chance under this bill, if it was passed, that the American citizens that have judgments against Iran could receive any money from those judgments. Do you agree or disagree with that assertion on his part?
If this legislation is passed and signed by the president, that is the purpose of the legislation, so that there can be relief for these families. So I don't agree with that.
And that's not what I said.
Let me finish.
If that's what he
No,
said.
that's not what I said. That's
Okay, well, I'll tell you what.
Want me to tell you what I said?
Yeah, because I want to make sure I get him to respond to
What
that.
I said is that this bill has no chance of passing. And I said, and if it did, it would result in us unilaterally breaking our agreement on the joint plan, which would result in sanctions relief by all these other countries because we were the ones who broke the agreement. And at the end of the day, that would be more beneficial to Iran.
And I'm reclaiming my time. I appreciate the clarification. So if this bill was passed and signed by the president, it would in fact result in billions of dollars potentially of payment to American citizens who have judgments entered by courts against Iran. Is that your understanding, Mr. Poe?
Yes.
And Mr. Poe, I don't know the entirety of your career, but at some point you were a judge in Texas, were you not?
I was.
There you go. Now, I listen to judges, Judge Hasty, and I've spent a career listening to judges. I didn't always agree with judges, but I know you didn't. And you could ask the judges in my area, they'll tell you they were frequently not agreeing with me. But I do appreciate your, Mr. Poe, your judicial experience. And the sponsor of this bill is Mr. Meehan, is that correct?
Correct.
Mr. Meehan has a distinguished career as a lawyer and as a prosecutor, is that correct?
Yes.
And so when he came up with this idea, his reason for this was he was using the experience that he had from the service, both as a lawyer in private practice and as a prosecutor. That's my understanding of where he got this from. Is that your understanding as well?
That's correct, based upon his and many other prosecutors and lawyers and judges having dealt with victims in criminal cases, and I was a criminal court judge for 22 years, so I heard those types of cases. And the interest of those victims to see that this was an opportunity for them to get relief, financial relief for lawful judgments that have already, lawsuits that have taken place. And so I think that was a part of his motivation. I can't speak for him, but it certainly looks like that was his motivation.
Well, in response to that, I just got to say, I would feel like I was not doing my duty if we weren't doing everything we possibly could to get these funds in the hands of American citizens who have lawful judgments against Iran. And I don't know what it does to this deal, and it really, I don't care what it does to this deal. I care about the citizens of the United States that have lawful judgments. And if passing this law will get them that, I think that's a good thing. And if my colleagues on the other side want to vote against it, that means we all have that prerogative. If the president wants to veto it once we pass it, that's certainly his prerogative. But I'm going to make sure that I do what I can do to get this money back for the citizens of the United States against the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world, who has killed United States citizens, who's killed United States service members. If we can get them compensated, I think that's a good thing, and I yield back.
Thank you. This gentleman from Washington,
I just have one quick question. Mr. McGovern's left the room. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Poe, could you speak a little bit to the issue that Mr. McGovern and Mr. Hastings brought up, that the assertion was made that this is just an effort to stop the agreement that was passed. It's no secret the Republicans voted against the agreement. Most of the Democrats supported it. And so that's on record, and that's not what we're arguing today. But it seems to me that the bill is saying if this agreement is going to move forward, accepting the fact that it probably will, that we as a country should hold some leverage to do all we can in order to get victims of these incidents compensated. And that's the way I'm looking at it. Could you comment on those assertions?
It's unthinkable that a government can sponsor the murder of other citizens in other countries and get away with it, as Iran has done through its terrorist proxies throughout the world. They continue to fund terrorism, murder. It occurs. Many of those people killed are Americans that are killed. We know that Iran is the sponsor. It has been proven in courts of law. It's not just an assumption. It's and under our process, Iran has been brought to court and has been found guilty on numerous occasions of the sponsor of murder of Americans. And they have gotten away with it since the 70s. This legislation says it's time you pay. Justice demands a day of reckoning. The chickens have come home to roost, and you're going to pay for what you have done to Americans. The way I see this legislation is an opportunity for us at this time when we're negotiating with Iran to say, look, you're going to pay for the murder of Americans before we move forward in this Iranian nuclear weapon. It's certainly injustice to me if we say, sorry, we'll get back with you on working out something with Iran to get lawfully compensated for the acts of terrorism against your families. We, I think, as a country, owe justice to the victims of Iran's state sponsor of terror. This is an opportunity for us to get them money, and I think that we have the obligation to do that. Sorry for the long answer, Mr. Chairman.
I have no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The chair thanks the witnesses. This then closes the hearing portion for H.R. 3457, and the committee stands adjourned.